If there's anything 2024 showed us, it's the power of social media to help mobilize those of a similar mind around a cause. A tool that was used to disseminate information and coordinate responses as Kenyans took to the streets to protest the finance bill of 2024, when their voices went ignored by their legislators. While the People's Movement is largely off the streets now, the resistance continues online. Suspected of orchestrating abductions to silence its critics, the government now says it will utilize legal channels to address what they define as abuse of social media.
Wherever we are not happy.
Wacha niseme initoke. Angry and frustrated by the disdain demonstrated by their representatives in pushing forward with the finance bill of 2024, in spite of a spirited, people-driven campaign against it, X provided a space where people could come together and revolt against a sense of hopelessness. After things went left, the state recognized the need to engage in these public barazas and dipped their toe into waters that proved treacherous.
A public forum.
I agree that some of our officials are arrogant.
Though the street protests have largely been contained, the online space has proven a difficult beast to tame. Posters bearing a call to action, giving way to caricatures, and in some cases distasteful AI-generated imagery that has made a mockery of the establishment. Though President William Ruto may have made out that he was in on the joke, at least where the nicknames are concerned, seeing a representation of himself lying dead in a casket hit a little too close to home. Perhaps realizing that abducting its critics may not be the most judicious course of action, the plan now is to arrest and prosecute those who abuse social media.
When we were being salamiwad, if I may use that terminology, tulikuwa tunasalamiwa. Sasa unapata mtu mzima, wengine hata ni profesa, anajua sheria, lakini anachukua namba ya mdavadi, anabwaga kule nje, anasema msalamie.
A Kenyan citizen, Felix Kibet, has sued X for allowing publication of pornography and hateful content on its platform. The Interior Ministry has called for these platforms to enhance their physical presence in the country, and the Ministry of Foreign Affairs has told its partners of the development of a technology responsibility charter to counter the sort of online campaigns that saw President Ruto receive an unprecedented number of nominations for Corrupt Person of the Year 2024, submitted to the Organized Crime and Corruption Reporting Project. And more recently, that has seen the Dutch government inundated with electronic communication, protesting a planned visit by its royals to Kenya at the invitation of the state. All right, that set the stage for our conversation tonight. As promised, I have with me in studio Mercy Mutemi, who is a digital rights and internet governance advocate. Karibu sana.
Thank you.
Good to have you on Citizen Weekend, as well as having you, Sherry Oyer. Thank you for being here. She is a programs officer, Kikternet. That is a think tank on internet policy and the like. All right, so I will start with you, Mercy.
Yes.
We heard there in that report, Musalia Mudavadi saying, you know, somebody put my number out there and told people, wanisalimie. What laws govern the limitations in Kenya of what you can and cannot do online?
Well, it's easy to get fixated in the world of online and forget that rights like freedom of expression and the right to privacy existed long before there was an internet or long before there was a social media platform. Freedom of expression is, I think, one of our most celebrated foundations of our constitution, which is basically that you have freedom of speech to share anything on whatever medium. In fact, the African Charter describes it as freedom across any media. And the limitation limitations are not that many. They're quite specific in Article 33(3) of the Constitution, which is freedom of expression doesn't extend to hate speech and doesn't extend to propaganda for war or incitement to violence. Quite brief and very specific. Anything outside of that is expression that is protected. And I think what we're seeing from the government is a panic similar to what was in the colonial period, when people use art to express political dissent or to have democratic conversations that are critical of the government. I mean, the idea behind the formation of the Kenya Film Classification Board was to ban some films from being staged at the theater, you know, political leaning speech from being. So we need to always make sure that we're not getting carried away by political conversation and reroute back to the Constitution that allows people to use whatever form of art, in this case, AI and artificial intelligence and deep fakes, to be critical of the government or to just share what they feel about governance. So that's really the framework that we're operating in. Article 33, post whatever you want, but make sure it's not amongst the categories of speech that's forbidden. Yes.
All right. So propaganda,
so hate speech, propaganda for war, incitement to violence, there can be no argument about that. And then if you're violating someone else's rights, for example, now we have a new form of violence against women, which is the deep fakes pornography, where your innocent picture that you shared on Instagram is being stolen from Instagram and then being doctored using AI to show that you're appearing, for example, in a pornographic video. So we have a lot of young girls who are experiencing this, where they're featuring in pornography videos that have been doctored using AI. So you see, that violates another right, which is the right to dignity and the right for protection of the young people, for example, and the right to privacy. So when you combine that, then that becomes something that violates the rights. But otherwise, being critical of the government or just forming your opinion and using AI to criticize the government is protected speech that should be protected.
All right.
Yeah.
We'll get into some detail, but first, you did raise technology facilitated gender-based violence, which is an area, Sherry, I believe you've published on. When you find yourself in such a situation, as Marcy has talked about, where your picture was taken, now you find yourself in a doctored image in underwear. Pornography, essentially. Deepfakes, you've talked about deepfakes as well. What recourse do you have?
So, unfortunately, as technology has continued to evolve, women again have been disproportionately affected. Gender-based violence always existed before the internet was in existence, and unfortunately, when we had the internet as well, women are disproportionately affected in terms of gender-based violence. There are different forms of gender-based violence on the internet called technology-facilitated gender-based violence, and one of the things that we are seeing is the use of new forms of technology like AI, for instance, making of deepfakes, are being used to disproportionately affect women and really abuse women on online platforms. So even the UN Women report, there's a UN Women report that says that of all AI that is being used for deepfakes, actually it's women it's mostly used for purposes of abusing women. So when you find yourself in such a situation, while you have the Computer Misuse and Cybercrimes Act that would actually deal with that provides for the cybercrimes, cyber harassment, for instance. It does not specifically provide for non-consensual sharing of intimate images or the manipulation of images for pornographic activities, for instance. So we still have a gap in that instance. But when you find yourself in that situation, there's the reporting mechanisms on those platforms. Unfortunately, we find that in most of the instances, because of the geopolitical aspect of it, that these platforms do not even exist in the country, for instance. Usually remedies are not as quick as it would be when it's, for instance, in the European Union or in the US, for instance. So we are finding that women are still suffering from this, especially in the African continent and specifically in Kenya, because of the lack of legal provisions. And when you talk about the Computer Misuse and Cybercrimes Act, it provides for, again, cyber cyber harassment, which would actually be more beneficial if it addressed these issues that are very pertinent instead of being very broad and curtailing free speech, for instance. So these are the things that we're still seeing that are still needs to be addressed as we go on.
Okay.
Yeah.
And I'm curious, Mas, because she's raised the issue of these, you can report on these platforms if you find yourself in a similar situation. We have a Kenyan the other day, Felix Kibet, who's sued X for hate speech, incitement to violence, some of what you mentioned at the very start. But when it comes to these social media operators, I know the government is pushing for them to have a physical presence here. You have sued them, Mercy, severally. Are they bound by Kenyan law? Is it just the user terms of reference that you agree, click yes or no, whether to join and abide by these terms? What takes precedence over the other?
Okay. So this has been a big debate on whether social media platforms that are headquartered in the US can be held accountable in Kenya for harms that are experienced in Kenya or harms that they have benefited from in Kenya. Because there's a different argument to this, in that for every viral abusive post, social media platforms are making millions from that post because of the advertising revenue that is adjacent to that post. So it's not even a question of them taking down the post, is should they be benefiting from posts, for example, that amount to hate speech or propaganda for war if it's shared. And on the 29th of January, actually, the High Court of Kenya is going to make a very pivotal decision on this, where we have sued Meta for allowing its platforms to be saturated with hate speech, propaganda for war, and incitement to violence. Notice that I'm being very specific on the kind of content we're describing, because I know there's a different conversation happening about abuse and misuse of social media platforms. It's not clear what abuse or misuse is, because that tends to shift depending on who is talking about the abuse and misuse. But I'm just, really limiting it to the categories of speech that are not guaranteed in the Constitution, and that's what we've sued Meta for. That it's not only allowing these posts on the platforms and to be seen in Kenya, but also benefiting from those posts when they're posted as ads. Meta has made that same argument that they cannot be sued in Kenya because they do not have any presence in Kenya. In two previous cases, the High Court of Kenya and the Court of Appeal has held that Meta can be sued in Kenya. So we're waiting to see what the court will say in that. So the issue about them not being held responsible because they are not in Kenya is a way that social media platforms are trying to get out of accountability. But this is my argument, that the digital world is new. So we have to redefine what jurisdiction looks like for this new world. The old laws of you have to come here and establish an office were created in an era where shipping companies had to have a physical office here for them to operate business, because, it's shipping, so you have to be physically there. But here, they make billions of revenue from here without physically being here. And what I'm looking forward to is a world where you can sue a social media platform where the harm is experienced without having to insist for their physical presence. The danger with going the path of insisting on their physical presence is what we're seeing in India now, where X was forced to have a physical presence in India, and the government is using that to force X to take down content that doesn't violate freedom of doesn't violate any laws, really, just political content. So if you refuse to take it down, then the cops are being sent to the office and people are getting arrested. So it's just harassment. So there's a very huge danger on insisting the governments be present, and we don't really need to go to that route while we are saying that there's a constitutional framework that regulates this. And let's not even talk about should they take down content or not. Let's just start fundamentally. Should they be making money off content that violates the Constitution? I think that's a more fundamental question. Mm-hmm. And on the question you'd asked earlier about what recourse people have, actually, we're preparing a class action suit against Telegram for allowing itself to be used as a platform for deepfake pornography that's affecting a lot of young people in Kenya. So if anyone has been affected, they can reach out to us as well, so we can include their claim there. Because what is very interesting is that these platforms have it in their terms and conditions that we do not allow this kind of content, but when you report, they don't take it down. So now you just have to force it through litigation, and we've seen going to court being an effective way to force companies to act right.
So how do they reach you?
They can reach us by emailing me at mercy@nzilisumbi.com, or even my Twitter handle at Mercy Mutemi. They can just reach out to us, and we can include them in the class action suit.
Okay. at Masi Mutemi?
Yes.
On X?
On X,
right.
yes.
Or
Masi at nzilisumbi.com.
Nzili?
Sumbi.
Sumbi.
Yes.
NZILISUMBI.com.
Yes.
All right. It sounds like it's a fine line, right? Yes. Between what is hate speech and maybe or what is considered hate speech or incitement to violence and maybe just a political stance you don't agree with. What about putting an image of a public figure, in this case, the president? There was an image of him in a casket. Sherry, is that freedom of expression or is that abuse of social media?
Okay, so as Masi has rightfully put it, there's a very thin line between, we need to make that distinction basically between what is freedom of expression, what is hate speech and all that. And freedom of expression covers everything. It does not just cover what you agree with or what is appealing to you. So freedom of expression is also inclusive of any speech that would even be considered offensive. So in that instance, when you're seeing people using social media for different purposes, we still have the right to picket and freedom of assembly and to protest, for instance. And people are using social media platforms now to do those things. And also remember that, as Masi has said, the limitations to freedom of expression. Yes, freedom of expression is not an absolute right, but also we have those limitations. So in that instance, what is considered free speech, for instance, if you're just putting someone's image in a coffin, it might be offensive to one person. So it's very subjective. And that is the reason why we are saying that having laws or trying to regulate the social media platforms in a way that could limit free speech it's tricky because, again, it could be very broadly, the terms could be very broad and they could be open to interpretation in any way. So if it is subjective, offensive, it could be offensive to one person, it could not be offensive. Maybe for some other person, they really just look at it and laugh at it and go on with their lives. But also speaking on that as well, for the African Court on Human and People's Rights court has on several occasions stated that for public figures, they should have a thicker skin, basically, a thicker skin to these things. So because they are in the public space, so they are open to criticism, and this will happen on different occasions. Freedom of speech, freedom of expression also, if it is true, there is nothing that you can do about it, for instance. So when you are criticizing, for instance, a government, there are those protections that you will have that you can actually do this if it is true, or if somebody will look at it from an offensive point of view, that perception, that is still not an offense under the law. So we have to look at the law very holistically and not regress to those situations where we had, I think, Masi, you will agree with me that Lesotho has insult laws, for instance. Yeah. That is very regressive. We have moved on from that. We need to have laws that are, I think, also to speak on the Constitution as well. If you're limiting free speech or if you're limiting freedom of expression, it has to pass the three-part test of is it provided for under the law, and is it legal, for instance? Is it proportional? Is it necessary to limit this freedom? So you have to look at it from a holistic point of view, not just, I think that most of the things that you've seen over from 2024 and especially this month are very reactive and not really looking at all the laws cohesively in order to inform the decisions that you're making. Yeah.
All right. So just listening to you, are we saying that different rules apply when you're a public figure vis-a-vis a private citizen, Masi?
100%. I'm not saying that. The courts are saying that. The law says that. So how privacy works, for example, is that the more open you are to the public and the more of a public-facing role you have, for example, you're using public funds, the less privacy you get to enjoy. And there's a reason to that, because people are entitled to know who their leaders are, what their leaders participate in, where the money is going. So that privacy film keeps shrinking the more public-facing that you are. It doesn't mean that it doesn't exist completely. So there's still some privacy you enjoy, but it's not the same as a private individual who never offered any information whatsoever. So I think there's another conversation as well to be had when we're having like this Kenyan context political conversation and looking at what is happening in the social media platforms themselves and the geopolitics that is affecting them. We see, for example, Meta taking a different stance from what it's been doing. It's been doing content moderation and fact checking, and now saying, oh, actually, we don't want to censor people anymore. We want people to express themselves more. And the Kenyan government saying the opposite, which is we don't want people to express themselves at all. So those two things are going to, none of those approaches, in my opinion, is good. Because on one hand, Meta hasn't been protecting the African continent users in any case. They haven't been doing a good job moderating content on the African continent, which is why in every country in Africa, during an electioneering period, there's complaints about violence that originates from Facebook, hate speech patterns, but also just politically heated conversations that end up turning into violence. On the other side, what Sherry is talking about, we see with the Computer Misuse and Cybercrimes Act, 2 offenses there by the name fake news, for example, where up to date, nobody has ever been sentenced for the offense of fake news, because what is that? Who gets to determine what is abuse of a social media platform, or what is appropriate, or what is moral? There's no arbiter of truth or arbiter of morality. So you have this thing that's just being used to harass journalists. When a blogger issues a statement, publishes something against a governor, the governor is using the police force to arrest them under fake news offenses or abuse offenses. And then the Office of the Director of Public Prosecutions goes to court and says, actually, I cannot try this case because I don't know what the truth is. I don't know what this offense is supposed to mean. And this is just being used to harass people and to shrink the public space, which is against the freedom of expression provisions. So when we have these conversations on abuse from a personality point of view, where it's a public figure we're trying to protect, we miss the point of what freedom of expression, privacy are supposed to achieve. As a whole, as people in this country, we have a right to expression, and that right includes artistic expression, even when offensive, that communicates either dissent or political discourse or democratic conversations. That freedom exists, and tolerance to that freedom by leaders is embedded in that right in itself. So it shouldn't be that everything that citizens are doing offends. It's more that you should listen to those conversations rather than trying to shrink those conversations, because that will never pass constitutional test that, this is lawful behavior to restrict people to express themselves. That will never pass, yeah.
Mm-hmm. And this, so you're saying public figures have been encouraged to develop a thicker skin. But what about scenarios where their families are caught up in the crossfire and you have somebody posting about their families? Is it fair game still?
So when it comes to families, of course, they're not public figures. Yeah. So we have to make that distinction between the public figure and then the life that they have separate from that public office. So yes, when there's picketing and protests on online platforms, we have to make sure that we'll see those, we don't cross those lines. Mm-hmm. So for instance, issues of privacy and data protection, sharing, if you were to share the number of governor's wife, for instance, who's not in a public figure, then that, of course, you are violating the Data Protection Act and their right to privacy. So we have to also be very cognizant of the fact that the public figure does not come with everyone who's associated with them. Still, there are laws that will be applicable that to these people who are not specifically holding that office. So the Data Protection Act, for instance, still will have to be applicable. So
can I sue in my private capacity?
Yes, yeah. Definitely you could, yeah. If it's a privacy issue, of course, you'd go to the Office of the Data Protection Commissioners to make that complaint, and you'll get sorted out, definitely, because the law is very clear. Yeah, we love saying the law is very clear as lawyers, but the Data Protection Act is very clear on that they would then have that protection.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you, ladies, for sharing your expertise tonight. We've had in studio Sherry Oyer, who is a programs officer at KitchenNet, and we've also had Mercy Mutemi, digital rights and internet governance advocate. You told us at Mercy Mutemi?
At Sherry Oyer.
At Sherry Oyer. Yes. So we take a break, but keep it Citizen Weekend because we have more coming up.